The year is 1876. The air in the small town of Redemption, Texas, had turned to sandpaper. A blistering sandstorm, born in the scorched lungs of the Chihuahua Desert, descended without mercy, clawing at the clapboard buildings and scouring the very hope from the sky. The sun. A moment ago, a white-hot coin was now a tarnished ghost behind a shroud of swirling ochre. Doors were barred, windows shuttered. The townsfolk, who knew the land's temper, hunkered down, tasting the grit that seeped through every crack and praying the wind wouldn't peel their roofs back like the lid of a tin can. It was a day to be inside, to be safe, to wait for the world to stop its furious screaming. But from the grand doors of the First Presbyterian Church, a figure burst forth, not seeking shelter but embracing the chaos. She was a bride, or what was left of one. Her dress, a confection of ivory lace and silk that had cost more than most men in this town made in a year, was already a casualty of her flight. The hem was shredded, stained with mud and something darker, and the fine fabric was choked with the same dust that filled the air. A delicate veil, meant to obscure a blushing face, was torn from her hair, catching on a splintered hitching post like a snagged ghost before the wind ripped it away and sent it tumbling into the maelstrom. She was Lena Hayes, though in that moment, she was little more than a terrified animal. Daughter of Silas Hayes, a man whose wealth from banking and cattle had built half of Redemption and whose influence owned the other half. Today was meant to be the crowning achievement of his empire, the day he sealed an alliance by marrying his only daughter to Jedediah Laramie, the eldest son of a family whose power was measured not in cattle, but in rifles and land grants that stretched to the horizon. It was a merger of dynasties, a transaction spoken of in hushed, reverent tones over whiskey in the town saloon and over tea in the stifling parlors. For everyone but Lena, it was a triumph. For Lena, it was a death sentence. She had seen the truth in Jedediah's eyes, not passion, not even mild affection, but a cold, possessive hunger. It was the look a wolf gives a lamb. She had felt the chill of it when his hand brushed hers, a touch that promised not tenderness, but ownership. She had heard the stories, the whispers about his cruelty, about a stable boy who'd been whipped near to death for a minor offense, about a saloon girl who'd left town with a bruised face and a haunted look. Her father had dismissed them as jealous gossip, but Lena knew. She knew that if she walked into that bridal chamber tonight, the person she was, the quiet girl who loved books and the scent of rain and the wild freedom of her horse, would be extinguished forever. A door would close, and a life would end. So she had run, in the suffocating space between saying I do and the final blessing. While the guests were rising to their feet, she had turned and fled. She'd ignored her father's bellow of rage, the shocked gasps of the Laramies, and the sight of her younger sister Clara's terrified, tear-filled eyes. She'd burst out of the church, ripped a stallion from its tether, a magnificent black beast belonging to the Laramie clan, and spurred it mercilessly toward the only escape she could see, the vast, unforgiving expanse of the open desert. For the first hour, adrenaline was her fuel. The horse, a powerful animal, devoured the miles. But the storm was a relentless pursuer. The wind shrieked in her ears, whipping her hair across her face in stinging lashes. The sand blasted her skin, abrading the soft flesh exposed by her low-cut gown. She could no longer see the town behind her, nor anything in front of her. The world was a blinding, roaring vortex of dirt. Then the horse screamed. A sound of pure terror as a tumbleweed the size of a barrel cartwheeled out of the brown haze and struck its legs. The stallion reared, eyes wide with panic, and Lena, an able rider but no match for a panicked warhorse in a hurricane of sand, was thrown. She landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs in a painful rush. The impact was a brutal, grounding shock. For a moment, she lay stunned, the taste of blood and grit in her mouth. When she scrambled to her feet, her ankles screaming in protest, the horse was gone, a fading shadow swallowed by the storm. She was alone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her adrenaline-fueled haze. She shouted, her voice a raw, feeble thing instantly devoured by the wind. She tried to walk, but her ankle buckled. The pain was a white-hot fire. She stumbled, fell, and rose again, dragging her injured leg through the shifting sand. She had no water, no weapon, no sense of direction. The grand dress, her cage of silk and lace, was now a deadly anchor, tangling around her legs, its weight a cruel mockery of the gilded life she had just fled. Hours bled into an eternity. The storm eventually blew itself out, its fury abating into a sullen, dust-choked haze. The sun returned, not as a gentle promise of dawn, but as an enemy, beating down with a physical weight. The heat was suffocating. Lena tore at the high collar of her dress, her fingers clumsy and weak. Her throat was a desert in itself, so dry it felt as if it might crack. Thirst was no longer a discomfort. It was a torment, an obsession that eclipsed all fear. Her mind began to fray. She saw mirages, shimmering lakes that dissolved into heat haze, riders on the horizon that turned out to be misshapen cacti. She talked to her sister, Clara, promising her she'd be back soon. She cursed her father, her voice a hoarse croak. Despair, a heavy, sinking stone, settled in her gut. This was it. She had run from one prison only to find a larger, more final one. She would die out here, another nameless skeleton for the coyotes to pick clean, her story untold. She crawled, her nails breaking against rock and thorny scrub. The pristine white of her dress was now the color of the earth she was dying on. She was no longer Lena Hayes, the banker's daughter. She was just a creature, driven by the last, flickering instinct of survival. It was then, as her vision began to tunnel into darkness, that a shape solidified out of the shimmering heat. It wasn't a mirage. It was real, a man, leading a horse. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in tune with the harsh rhythms of this land. He was still a distance away, but she could see the weathered lines of his face, a face carved from granite and baked by 1,000 suns just like this one. He wore worn denim and leather chaps, and the hat on his head was pulled low, shadowing eyes that she knew would be missing nothing. He was a cowboy, a creature of this wilderness, as much a part of it as the vultures circling high above. His name was Calder. He was returning from a 3-day trek tracking a mountain lion that had been preying on his meager flock of sheep. He was tired, thirsty, and wanted nothing more than the cool shade of his small, isolated cabin. He was a man who had made a pact with solitude, who had learned the hard way that other people were a currency of trouble he could no longer afford. He had buried his wife, buried his past, and sought refuge in the silence of the Red Rock canyons. He saw her first as a strange heap of white against the red dirt. His hand went instinctively to the Colt peacemaker at his hip. Trouble. His first thought was to turn, to ride around whatever mess this was. But something made him hesitate. It was the unnaturalness of it. As he drew closer, the heap resolved into the shape of a woman in a torn, filthy wedding dress, crawling through the dust like a wounded animal. Lena saw him stop. She used the last of her strength to push herself up onto her knees. He was her last hope, or her final doom. He could be a savior, or one of them, a man sent by her father or the Laramies. He was walking toward her now, his steps measured, cautious. He didn't look kind. He looked hard, impassive, his face a mask of stoicism. He stopped a few feet from her. His shadow fell over her, a momentary, blessed relief from the sun. She looked up, her vision swimming. She saw a square jaw, a thick, dark mustache, and eyes the color of a stormy sky, narrowed with suspicion. She opened her mouth, her cracked lips splitting. No sound came out at first, just a dry rasp. She swallowed, a painful, desperate effort. She had to speak. She had to make him understand. "Don't," she whispered, the sound fragile as a dying leaf. her eyes wide with a terror that transcended her physical pain, locked onto his. "Don't take me back to them!" Her plea hung in the hot, still air between them, a prayer offered to a stone god. "Please." And then the last thread of her consciousness snapped. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed forward into the dust. Calder moved faster than he had in years. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms closing around her. He was shocked by how light she was, a bundle of bone and ruined silk. As he held her, the raw, desperate plea echoed in the silent wilderness. It wasn't a request for help, or for water, or for comfort. It was a plea for freedom, and that was a language Calder, in the deepest, most scarred part of his soul, understood all too well. He had just wanted to get home. Instead, trouble, in the form of a runaway bride, had just fainted in his arms. Calder's ranch was less a home and more a final argument with the world. It was nestled deep in a fold of the Red Rock Canyons, a place you couldn't find unless you already knew it was there. The journey was arduous, with the unconscious woman a dead weight in his arms. He'd managed to get her onto his horse. Her slight frame slumped against his chest as he walked, leading the animal through narrow, winding game trails where the stone walls on either side seemed to close in, shutting out the sky. There was no road to his property, only this difficult path that discouraged visitors and taxmen alike. He wanted it that way. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a testament to his solitude, built of sun-bleached timber and river stone. It was small and stark, braced against a sheer cliff face as if for protection. A crooked porch, a small corral, and a barn that leaned with the prevailing wind were the only other structures. The land around it was cracked and thirsty, dotted with stubborn sagebrush and the occasional gnarled juniper tree. Loneliness was etched into every board, every stone. It was in the mournful whistle of the wind as it squeezed through a gap in the window frame and in the stark silence that fell the moment it ceased. This was Calder's sanctuary, the place he had come to let the world forget him. He carried her inside, the scent of her fear and the desert dust clinging to her. The single room of the cabin was neat but bare. A stone hearth, a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding a few books and tins of food. He laid her on his own cot, her body sinking into the thin mattress. For a moment, he just looked at her, at the grime-caked face and the bloodied hem of her ridiculous dress. Trouble. Pure, uncut trouble in a package of torn lace. His hands were rough, but his movements were surprisingly gentle as he tended to her. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to fending for himself. He cleaned the gash on her forehead and the scrapes on her arms with whiskey from his flask. Ignoring her faint whimpers, her ankle was swollen and bruised. He wrapped it tightly with a strip of clean cloth. The dress, a useless garment of wealth, was an impediment. With a grimace, he took his hunting knife and carefully cut away the dirtiest, most restrictive parts of the bodice and skirt. Leaving her in her chemise, he covered her with a thick wool blanket, then sat at the table, watching her in the fading light, his face an unreadable mask. His plan was simple. He'd give her a day, maybe 2, to get her strength back. Then he would give her a canteen of water, a piece of jerky, and point her in the direction of the nearest town, a town that wasn't redemption. He wasn't a cruel man, but he was a finished one. He'd made his peace with solitude, and he would not let this ghost from the world of men disturb it. Lena woke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing coffee. For a disoriented second, she thought she was home, in her own bed. Then the pain in her ankle lanced up her leg, and memory came crashing back. The church, the storm, the endless, burning desert. Her eyes flew open. Fear seized her, cold and absolute. She wasn't in the desert. She was in a small, dark room, a rough blanket scratching her skin. A man sat at a table across from her, his back to her, sharpening a knife. A small, choked sound escaped her throat. Calder didn't turn around. "You're safe," he said, his voice a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. For now. He finished his work on the blade. The scrape of steel on the stone the only sound. There's water on the crate beside you. Drink it slow. She pushed herself up, her body screaming in protest. The room was just as she'd feared. Unfamiliar, isolated, a prison of a different kind. Her eyes darted around, looking for an escape, for a weapon. She saw her tattered dress piled in a corner like a dead animal. He had undressed her. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. When he finally turned to face her, she flinched. His expression was impassive, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat, which he wore even indoors. He pushed a tin plate with a piece of hardtack and dried meat across the table. Eat. She didn't move. Who are you? Where am I? Name's Calder. This is my place. You're a long way from anywhere. You have to help me, she whispered, her voice cracking. They're looking for me. You can't let them find me. Who's they? He asked, his tone flat. Lena hesitated, the ingrained habit of discretion warring with her desperation. To speak the names of Hayes and Laramie was to unleash a power that could crush a man like him. My family, she finally said, the word tasting like ash. The men they want me to belong to. Calder grunted, a non-committal sound. Eat, he repeated. Your family troubles ain't my concern. He thought his mind was made up, but then he began to watch her. He saw the way she drank the water, not like a lady, but like a soldier dying of thirst. He watched her eat, tearing at the tough jerky with her teeth, her eyes constantly scanning the room, the door, the single window. She moved with a skittish, animal caution, as if expecting a blow to fall at any moment. At night, he took the floor, giving her the cot, and on the second morning, when he went to take the blanket to air it out, he found it, a small paring knife, stolen from his kitchen block, hidden beneath the thin pillow. He stood there for a long time, the knife in his palm. This wasn't the act of a lost girl. This was the act of a hunted creature. This small, sharp piece of steel spoke more about her fear than any of her vague pleas. It told him that whoever she was running from, she believed they were worth killing or dying to escape. That evening, as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the canyons in hues of fire and blood, Calder sat on his porch, cleaning his rifle. His mind drifted back, pulled by the undertow of memory. He remembered his life before this self-imposed exile. He'd been a soldier, a sergeant who had seen the horrors of Shiloh and Antietam. He had fought for ideals, for union, for freedom. He had returned from the war, sick of causes and crowds, wanting only to build a quiet life with his wife, Eleanor. They had been happy, in a small town not so different from redemption, but he hadn't learned his lesson. He'd still believed in right and wrong. He'd interfered, standing up for a homesteader being bullied by a powerful rancher. He'd spoken out, used his reputation as a war hero to rally support. His interference had escalated the conflict, turning a land dispute into a blood feud. It ended with a botched bank robbery, a message from the rancher. Eleanor had been inside. She'd been caught in the crossfire. He had lost everything, his wife, his faith, his belief in the goodness of getting involved. He'd buried her, sold their small plot of land, and ridden away until he found this place, the most isolated, defensible patch of earth he could claim. He had sworn an oath to himself on Eleanor's grave. Never again. He would never again stand in the path of another man's trouble. And Lena Hayes, with her haunted eyes and her hidden knife, was the biggest storm of trouble he had ever seen. He would send her away in the morning. The decision settled in his chest, heavy and cold as a stone. Later that night, the sound of a horse's nervous whicker woke him. He was instantly alert, grabbing the rifle he kept by his side, moving with silent, practiced steps. He slipped out of the cabin and crept towards the barn. He expected a wolf, or perhaps a mountain lion. Instead, he found Lena. She was huddled in the hay of an empty stall, her arms wrapped around her knees, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was so lost in her grief she hadn't heard him approach. Calder stood in the shadows, his anger at being woken warring with a tired reluctance. He was about to order her back to the cabin when he heard her whisper. It was a name, spoken through her tears, over and over again like a prayer. "Clara, I'm so sorry. Clara, forgive me." He stopped. She wasn't crying for herself. She wasn't weeping over her torn dress or her lost fortune or her fear. She was crying for someone else. For a sister she had been forced to leave behind. It was a grief born of love, not self-pity. It was a pain that was clean, honest. And in that moment, it sliced through the calloused walls he had built around his heart. He knew that kind of pain. He knew the agony of being the one left standing. He didn't say a word. He backed away as silently as he had come, leaving her to her sorrow. He went back to the cabin, but not to sleep. He sat at the table until dawn, the paring knife on the wood in front of him. The stone in his chest had shifted. One more day. He would let her stay one more day. The routine they settled into was unspoken. She helped where she could, her movements still wary but less frantic. He showed her how to draw water from the well without wasting a drop, how to mend a tear in his shirt with clumsy stitches. They rarely spoke, but a fragile truce existed between them. The truce was shattered on the 5th morning. As Calder went out to check the corral fence, he saw it, tied to the top rail of the fence gate, fluttering in the morning breeze, was a strip of fine white silk torn from a wedding veil. Attached to it was a piece of expensive cardstock. The script was elegant, a stark contrast to the rough wood of the fence, but the message was brutally simple. Asterisk. We know you have her. The Laramie family reclaims its property. There is no rock you can hide her under where we will not find her. Calder ripped the note from the fence, his knuckles white. They had found him. The world he had run from, the trouble he had sworn to avoid, had followed this girl right to his doorstep and hammered a notice on his gate. His sanctuary was no longer safe. The discovery of the note on the fence changed everything. The threat was no longer a distant shadow on the horizon. It was a physical presence, a violation of the sanctity of Calder's isolated world. The fragile truce of their silence was over. That afternoon, he walked out of the cabin holding not a plate of food, but his spare Colt Peacemaker. He placed it firmly in Lena's hands. "If you're staying," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, "you learn to be useful. More than that, you learn to be dangerous. The world's found us. It won't be polite when it comes knocking again." Her training began not with a choice, but with an ultimatum. The soft hands that had known only embroidery needles and the smooth keys of a piano were now forced to learn the harsh language of survival. He taught her to ride, not side saddle like the ladies in town, but astride his steady-packed mule, her torn dress hitched up awkwardly around her thighs. He showed her how to grip with her knees, to become one with the animal's rhythm, to ride for speed and endurance, not for show. She was clumsy at first, her body sore and bruised, but she never once complained. She simply gritted her teeth, pulled herself back onto the mule's broad back each time she slipped, and tried again. The lessons with the pistol were harder. The gun was impossibly heavy in her grasp, a cold, dense weight of deadly purpose. The first time he made her fire it, the sound was a physical blow, a deafening crack that seemed to split the sky. The recoil jolted her entire body, sending a painful shock up her arm and knocking her back a step. Her ears rang and the smell of sulfur filled her nostrils. She had missed the tin can he'd set on a rock by a mile. "Again," was all he said. Day after day, they practiced. He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. Slowly, painstakingly, the shots crept closer to their mark. She hated the weapon, hated the violence it represented, but she hated the feeling of helplessness more. With each successful shot that sent a can spinning into the dust, a piece of the terrified girl who had fled redemption died, and a harder, more resilient woman began to take her place. Calder watched this transformation in silence, a flicker of something akin to respect in his guarded eyes. She was no simpering town belle. She had grit. Their days fell into a rhythm of hard shared labor. The well he'd been meaning to dig for a year became their joint project. They worked under the relentless sun, taking turns with the pick and shovel, their bodies slick with sweat. In the golden, dusty light of the long afternoons, they moved rocks and heaved timber to rebuild the wall of the leaning barn. The work was grueling, bone-wearying, but it was honest. In the shared strain of lifting a heavy beam, in the simple act of passing a canteen of water back and forth, a new kind of communication formed between them. They were no longer just a man and the trouble he'd found. They were partners, bound by the common goal of holding this small patch of earth against the world. Trust was built not with words, but with sweat and calluses. The words came later, in the exhausted quiet of the evenings. One night, as they sat by the fire, the shadows dancing on the cabin walls, Lena finally gave him a piece of her past. "My mother," she began, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the flames. "She knew what Jedediah Laramie was. She tried to help me. She begged my father to call off the wedding." Calder listened, his face impassive as he cleaned his rifle. "My father, he doesn't tolerate disobedience. From anyone. He said my mother was becoming hysterical, that her nerves were frayed. He said her defiance was a sickness." She took a shuddering breath. "He had her committed to an asylum in San Antonio. He told everyone she had gone for a rest cure. He locked her away so he could sell me." The confession hung in the air, stark and ugly. Calder stopped his work. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the runaway bride to the abandoned daughter, a girl whose own mother had been sacrificed for the sake of a business deal. He saw the root of the terror that had driven her into the desert. He surprised himself by speaking of his own ghosts. "Towns," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Can't trust 'em. Can't trust the people in 'em." He set the rifle aside. "My wife, Eleanor. She loved town, loved the socials, the people. She believed folks were decent at heart." He paused, the memory a physical pain. There was a land dispute, a rich man trying to run off a poor one. I was a fool. I got involved, spoke up at a town meeting. It turned ugly. A week later, some men rode in to rob the bank. They said it was a robbery, but it was a message meant for me. Eleanor was inside, depositing money for the church bake sale. He didn't have to finish. The bleak finality in his voice told the rest of the story. She was killed for a principle. For my principle. I learned then that people in towns, they just bring their troubles to your door. In the flickering firelight, they looked at each other. Two solitary souls who had each lost their world to the cruelty and greed of other men. A bridge of shared sorrow was built across the small space between them. The threat from the Laramies was not idle. A few weeks later, they were spotted. Calder and Lena had ridden out further than usual, checking a series of traps he had set for pelts. They were in a high-sided canyon when Calder suddenly reined in his horse, his body going rigid. He pointed, on a distant ridge. Two riders were silhouetted against the bright blue sky, watching them. "Don't look at them," Calder hissed. "Turn slow. We're going back." But it was too late. The figures on the ridge began to move, their horses scrambling down the shale slope. The chase was on. Calder spurred his horse, yelling for Lena to follow, and they galloped down the winding canyon. The sound of their horses' hooves echoed off the rock walls, a frantic, desperate drumming. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, but her training took over. She clung to the mule, leaning into the turns, her eyes fixed on Calder's back. The pursuers were gaining. A gunshot cracked, the bullet whining off the rock face far to their left. Calder didn't fire back. He was conserving his energy, his focus entirely on the path ahead. He knew these canyons better than any man alive. He led them through a narrow split in the rock, a passage barely wide enough for a single horse, and into a maze of smaller, twisting ravines. They rode for what felt like an eternity, the horses lathered and their own lungs burning, until Calder finally led them into a thick stand of cottonwoods by a hidden spring and dismounted, pulling her down with him. They stood in the shadows, listening, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of the pursuing hoofbeats faded. Lost in the labyrinth of stone, they were safe. The adrenaline drained away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its place, as if on cue. The sky, which had been clear moments before, turned a bruised purple. The temperature dropped. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the canyon, and the heavens opened. A cold, torrential rain began to fall, turning the dust to mud in an instant. There was no shelter. They mounted their tired horses and began the long, slow ride back to the cabin, soaked to the skin within minutes. The rain washed the dust and sweat from their bodies, plastering their clothes to them, but it couldn't wash away the tension of the chase. They rode in silence, the only sound the squelch of hooves in the mud and the steady drumming of the rain. They stumbled into the cabin as dusk was falling, shivering and dripping. Water pooled at their feet on the wooden floor. Calder moved immediately to the hearth, his hands shaking slightly as he struck a match and coaxed a fire to life. The flames caught, casting a warm, dancing light into the gloomy room. Lena stood shivering, her arms wrapped around herself, unable to stop the chattering of her teeth. Calder turned from the fire. He looked at her, at the way her wet chemise clung to her skin, at the rivulets of water tracing paths down her neck, at her dark hair slicked back from a face that was pale with cold and exhaustion. The hardened survivor was gone, and for a moment, he saw only the vulnerable woman beneath. He went to his sparse cupboard and took down a tin cup and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. He poured a generous measure and handed it to her. "Drink. It'll warm you." She took the cup in her trembling hands and drank. The fiery liquid burned a path down her throat, but a welcome heat began to spread through her chest. She coughed and handed the cup back to him. He took a swallow and passed it back. They stood there by the fire, sharing the cup, passing it between them in a silent, intimate ritual. The fire crackled, the rain hammered on the roof, in the small, warm space of the cabin. The rest of the world, with its threats and its dangers, seemed to fall away. Calder reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before he gently brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was like a spark on dry tinder. Lena's breath hitched. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark in the firelight. His face was closer now, the hard lines of it softened by the shadows. He wasn't looking at her like a nuisance, or a student, or a piece of trouble. He was looking at her like a man looks at a woman. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She stood frozen, caught in the gravity of the moment. His lips met hers. It wasn't a passionate kiss or a gentle one. It was hesitant, rough, and deeply uncertain. A questioning touch, born of shared danger, exhaustion, and a profound loneliness neither of them had admitted to. It was brief, lasting only a few seconds, but in that space, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. Then, as if startled by their own actions, they both pulled back at the same time. The space between them now felt charged, dangerous. Lena stared at her feet, her cheeks burning. Calder turned away abruptly, staring into the flames as if he could find an answer there. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the relentless rain. A line had been crossed, and neither of them knew what to do next. The silence that followed their kiss was heavier than any storm. For days, an invisible wall stood between them, charged with the memory of that brief, hesitant touch. They moved around the small cabin with a careful, deliberate distance, their words clipped and practical, limited to the necessities of their existence. The easy rhythm of shared work was gone, replaced by a tense awareness that made every accidental brush of their hands feel like a brand. Calder's face was a mask of stone, more guarded than ever, while Lena's eyes were filled with a new and painful uncertainty. The bridge of trust they had so carefully built now seemed impassable, shrouded in a fog of unspoken questions. The outside world shattered the fragile tension. Calder had ridden to a remote trading post miles to the south, a place frequented by trappers and prospectors, to trade a few pelts for flour and salt. He returned just after dusk, his movements stiff with a cold fury that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire canyon. He strode into the cabin without a word, dropped the sack of supplies on the floor with a thud, and threw a crumpled piece of paper onto the table. It was a reward poster. The paper was cheap, the ink already starting to run, but the drawing was skillful enough to be a cruel caricature of Lena's face. Beneath it, the words were stark and clear. $*$1,000 for information leading to the safe return of Alara Hayes. It was signed with the bold, arrogant flourish of her father, Silas Hayes. $1,000, Calder said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He's put a price on your head like you're a stray mare. Every broke prospector, bounty man, and back-shooting coward from here to the territories will be crawling over these rocks looking for you. Looking for ***. The blood drained from Lena's face. $1,000 was a fortune. It was enough to make a man kill his own brother. I told you, Calder went on, his anger finally breaking its leash as he began to pace the small room like a caged wolf. I told you I wanted no part of this. I built this place to be left alone. I buried my life once. I will not let your father and your rich suitor make me bury it again. He stopped and pointed a shaking finger at the door. You have to go, now. I'll give you the mule and enough supplies for 2 days. After that, you're on your own. The word struck Lena harder than any physical blow. To be cast out now, into a wilderness filled with men hunting her for money, was a death sentence. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. No, you can't. I can and I will, he roared, his control snapping. My wife died because I stuck my nose in other people's trouble. I will not make that mistake again. Not for you. Not for anyone. Please, she begged, tears streaming down her face as she stumbled towards him. Please, Calder, don't do this. I have nowhere to go. She fell to her knees before him, grabbing the rough fabric of his trousers, her entire body shaking with desperate sobs. They'll find me. They'll take me back to him. Please. Her pleading only seemed to fuel his rage. It was the desperate sound of the trap he could feel closing around him. He grabbed her by the arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. Your tears don't change anything. You've brought a war to my door, and I will not fight it for you. Something inside Lena broke. The fear, the exhaustion, the endless running. It all coalesced into a single, sharp point of fury. She wrenched her arms from his grasp, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. You think this is about a wedding? She screamed, her voice raw with pain and indignation. You think I ran from a man I simply did not like? I didn't run because I was scared of getting married. I ran because I wanted to live. The words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the cabin. It was not a plea, but a declaration, a raw cry for existence that stripped away all pretense. It hit Calder with the force of a physical blow, cutting through his anger and his fear, and laying bare the stark, simple truth of her flight. He stared at her, at the tears carving paths through the dust on her cheeks, and for the first time, he saw the full depth of the abyss she was running from. The fight left them both hollowed out and shaking. Calder stood frozen, his own harsh words tasting like poison in his mouth. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't bear the weight of what she had just revealed. Overwhelmed by a tidal wave of guilt, fear, and a terrifying, protective instinct he refused to acknowledge. He did the only thing he could. He fled. He turned without another word, strode out of the cabin, and saddled his horse with violent, jerky movements. He rode out of the canyon like a man possessed, leaving Lena alone with the silence and the damning reward poster on the table. He rode until the fury and confusion in his chest had been pounded into a dull, throbbing ache by the horse's gallop. He ended up, as if by instinct, at a place fit for his mood. A rough-and-tumble saloon near an abandoned silver mine. A deadfall saloon where desperate men went to forget their failures. He stormed inside, threw a coin on the bar, and began to drink. Back at the cabin, Lena's terror quickly eclipsed her anger. He had gone, and he had been consumed by a black mood. The men who were hunting her were out there, and now they would be hunting him, too. The thought of him walking into a trap, drunk and alone, was unbearable. He had saved her. She could not let him die because of her. With a grim resolve, she took the rifle from its pegs on the wall, checked that it was loaded, and saddled the mule. She was no tracker, but Calder's horse had left a clear trail in the soft earth. She followed it into the growing darkness. The saloon was a haze of cheap whiskey and despair. Calder drank steadily, trying to burn away the image of Lena's face, but the liquor only seemed to sharpen it. After his third glass, he slammed it down on the bar and walked out into the cold night air. The alcohol had done nothing but curdle the anger in his gut. He was halfway to his horse when two shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of an alley between the saloon and the assayer's office. "Calder, ain't it?" one of them rasped. "Heard you found some lost property. The Laramies and Silas Hayes send their regards, and they're willing to pay for what's theirs." Calder's hand dropped to his Colt, but he was too slow, his senses dulled by the whiskey. The second man lunged, grabbing his gun arm, while the first drove a fist into his stomach. The air exploded from his lungs. He fought back with a feral desperation, but it was 2 against 1, and they were sober. They wrestled him to the ground, the dust choking him, a knee grinding into his back. He felt the cold, hard press of a pistol barrel against his temple. "This can be easy," the first man grunted, "or it can be messy." Suddenly, a deafening crack split the night. It wasn't the sound of the pistol at Calder's head. It came from the rocks overlooking the alley. The man holding him down grunted, a sound of pained surprise, and collapsed sideways, clutching a blossoming red stain on his shoulder. The second man stared in shock, scrambling back and firing a wild shot toward the rocks. Calder used the moment to kick out, sweeping the man's legs from under him. Before he could recover, another rifle shot kicked up the dirt right beside his head. That was enough. The hired gun scrambled to his feet and disappeared into the night. Stunned, Calder pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the dark ridge. A figure emerged from behind a boulder, small and hesitant, holding the rifle. It was Lena. He ran to her, adrenaline coursing through him. She was staring down at the wounded man, who was now moaning and trying to crawl away. The rifle slipped from her fingers, clattering on the rocks. She was trembling from head to foot, her face a ghostly white in the moonlight. I shot him," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "Oh, God, Calder, He reached her and pulled her into his arms, turning her away from the sight. "Shh, you're all right. You saved my life. Lena." He held her tight, his own anger and fear forgotten, replaced by a wave of fierce, overwhelming protectiveness. She had faced down armed men for him. She had taken a life, or close to it, to save his. In that moment, he knew his vow of non-involvement was a lie. He was in this all the way. He half carried her to the horses. They couldn't go back to the ranch. They couldn't go anywhere near the saloon. They rode north into the wild, unmapped hill country, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the town. They finally stopped hours later, when the horses were exhausted, taking shelter in a shallow cave carved out of a rock face by an ancient river. The night was cold. They built a small, smokeless fire deep inside the cave. The adrenaline of the fight had worn off, leaving them both raw and exposed. They sat side by side, not touching, watching the tiny flames, the walls of Calder's heart, the defenses he had spent years building, had been shot to pieces. He looked at her, at this woman who had fought for him, who had run from a gilded cage only to land in his world of dirt and danger, and he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it stole his breath. He reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Her fingers, still cold, curled around his. There were no words. There was no need for them. The shared brush with death, the violence, the rescue. It had burned away everything but the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation. His kiss was not questioning, but desperate and certain. She met it with equal force, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. It was a kiss of raw, primal need, a fierce affirmation of life in the face of death. All the barriers, all the fears and unspoken words, crumbled into dust. In the flickering firelight of their makeshift shelter, surrounded by the vast, wild darkness, they came together not in tenderness, but in a wild, frantic collision of two souls who had been stripped bare, finding in each other a desperate, necessary, and breathtaking solace. The cave was a temporary sanctuary, but the ranch was home. They returned under the cover of darkness 2 days later, not to the cautious truce of before, but to something new and uncharted. The single cot, which had once been a source of awkward distance, now became a shared space of warmth against the cold desert nights. The wall between them, breached by the violence of the ambush and the desperation of their union, had not been rebuilt. They lived, for a few short weeks, as if they were the only two people left in the world. Their days were still filled with the hard labor of survival, but now it was punctuated by moments of an easy, unspoken intimacy. A lingering touch as he handed her an axe, the way she would watch him from the porch as he mended a fence, the shared smiles over a simple meal of beans and coffee. Calder found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her small stories about the land, about tracking a particular buck, about the way the light changed on the canyon walls at sunset. He was teaching her his world, and she, in turn, was reawakening his laughter. A sound as foreign as a church bell in that lonely canyon began to echo in the small cabin. For Lena, the physical closeness was a balm, a fierce and grounding counterpoint to the terror that still lived in her heart. In Calder's arms, she found a safety she had never known, a strength that was not controlling, but protective. Yet, she held a part of herself back, a locked room deep inside that she would not let him enter. She learned to mend and cook and shoot, transforming her body into a tool for survival. But she could not seem to mend the deepest fracture within her soul. Calder felt it. He was a man attuned to the subtleties of the wild, the nervous flick of a deer's ear, the change in the wind that signaled a coming storm. He could feel the hesitation in her, the shadow that would pass over her eyes at the most unexpected moments. He would see it when he caught her staring out towards the distant, hazy line of the horizon, her expression lost and sorrowful. "What do you think of planting a real garden next spring?" he asked one evening, gesturing to a patch of earth near the cabin. "Corn, squash, things that'll last the winter. We could build a root cellar." He was speaking of a future, of seasons turning, of a life built together. The light in her eyes flickered and died. She turned away, suddenly busy with a loose thread on her sleeve. "The soil is very rocky here," was all she said. The subject was closed. He tried again another time. "When this is over, when they stop looking, what will you do?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She went utterly still, her hands ceasing their work of kneading dough. A profound sadness settled over her features. "I don't know," she whispered, and he knew it was a lie. She knew, but she wouldn't or couldn't tell him. He sensed her fear was not for herself, but for him. He was a complication she had not intended, a life she had stumbled into and was now terrified of destroying. The more he cared for her, the more he felt like a man holding a precious, beautiful bird with a broken wing. He wanted to heal it, to make it stay, but he lived with the constant, gnawing fear that it was only a matter of time before it flew away, or was snatched from his hands. This fragile happiness felt borrowed, temporary, a peaceful eye in the center of a hurricane he knew was still raging just beyond the canyon walls. The hurricane arrived on a still, hot afternoon in the form of a man on a smoke-gray horse. He did not ride in like a man with a purpose. He simply appeared at the edge of the clearing, as if he had materialized from the heat haze. He was dressed entirely in black, a fine wool suit, incongruous and stifling in the desert heat, covered in a fine layer of dust. He sat his horse with a stillness that was more menacing than any weapon, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. His face was thin and pale, with eyes that were flat and emotionless, like chips of obsidian. Calder was splitting wood when he saw him. He set the axe down slowly, every nerve in his body screaming a warning. He wiped his sweaty hands on his trousers and moved to stand between the stranger and the cabin, where he knew Lena was watching from the window. "That's far enough," Calder called out, his voice steady. His hand rested inches from the Colt at his hip. The man in black did not smile. He didn't seem capable of it. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of cold, mocking politeness. "I have no business with you, Calder," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, yet it carried across the clearing with perfect clarity. "I'm here with a message for the girl." "She's not hearing any messages," Calder said, his stance widening. "Ride on." The man ignored him, his dead eyes fixed on the cabin door. "The Laramies are patient men," he said, as if reciting a catechism. "They understand a spirited filly needs to be broken, but their patience is not endless. The wedding is being rescheduled. Her father has guaranteed her cooperation this time." From behind him, Calder heard the cabin door creak open. Lena stepped out onto the porch, her face as white as bone. She held the rifle he had taught her to use, but her hands were trembling so badly it was a wonder she could hold it at all. The man in black finally looked at Calder, a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, or contempt, in his gaze. He had seen the terror on Lena's face and understood he had accomplished his mission. He gathered his reins, preparing to leave. "You do well to walk away from this," the man said to Calder, his voice dropping to a confidential, venomous whisper. "You think you saved her? You think you have some claim on her?" He gave a dry, mirthless chuckle. "She doesn't belong to you. She was bought with blood and guns." Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away as silently as he had come, disappearing back into the shimmering heat that had birthed him. He left his words hanging in the air, a poison that seeped into the very foundations of the life they had built. That night, an impenetrable wall of silence descended upon the cabin. Lena was a ghost, moving through the motions of preparing their meager supper, her face a mask of numb despair. Calder tried to speak to her, to break the spell of the stranger's words, but she would not meet his eye. The threat, bought with blood and guns, had a weight to it, a finality that he could not argue against. It spoke of a debt, of a history that he knew nothing about. He awoke in the dead of night to a profound and unnerving coldness beside him on the cot. He reached out. The space was empty. He sat bolt upright, his heart seizing in his chest. A sliver of moonlight fell across the room, illuminating the table. On it was a folded piece of paper. He stumbled from the bed, his hands shaking as he lit a lamp. The note was written in her elegant, practiced script, but the letters were shaky, blurred in places as if by tears. Asterisk, my dearest Calder. Asterisk, forgive me. Forgive me for bringing this darkness to your door. The man was right. I do not belong to you. I do not belong to myself. I ran away to save my own life, and now I must leave to save yours. Do not follow me. Please, forget you ever saw me. It is the only way you will be safe. I will never forget what you have given me. Thank you for showing me what it feels like to be free, if only for a little while. Asterisk, Lena asterisk. The world tilted on its axis. He ran outside, shouting her name into the uncaring darkness. The canyon threw his desperate cries back at him. He checked the corral. The mule was gone. So was the rifle, and the paring knife she had once hidden under her pillow. A wave of utter desolation washed over him, a grief so profound it was a physical agony. It was the same hollow, soul-crushing loss he had felt when he'd stood over Eleanor's grave. He had allowed himself to hope again, allowed himself to care, and the universe had punished him for it by ripping it all away. He stumbled back into the cabin, the empty, silent space a torment. He saw the life they had built, the neatly stacked firewood, the mended curtain, the 2 tin plates on the shelf, and a black, destructive rage boiled up inside him. He let out a raw, animalistic roar of pain and swept his arm across the table, sending the lamp, the plates, and the note crashing to the floor. He kicked the table over. He grabbed the remaining bottle of whiskey and drank, not for warmth or solace, but for oblivion. He drank until the edges of the room blurred and the pain in his chest became a dull, stupid ache. He collapsed onto the floor amidst the wreckage of their life, the bottle slipping from his grasp. He was alone again. He had lost everything. Again. He closed his eyes, welcoming the encroaching darkness. He didn't know how long he lay there. It could have been minutes or hours. But through the drunken haze, a faint, flickering light penetrated his closed eyelids, a soft, warm glow. He forced his heavy eyes open. His gaze drifted towards the window. A single candle was burning on the sill. He blinked, convinced it was a trick of the whiskey, a phantom conjured by his grieving mind. But it didn't vanish. It burned with a small, steady flame, a tiny beacon of defiance against the overwhelming night. He pushed himself up, his body protesting, and staggered to the door, pulling it open. She was standing on the porch, her form a silhouette against the moonlit canyon. The mule stood behind her, its reins held loosely in her hand. She had come back. She had turned around and come back. Tears were streaming down her face, but she stood her ground, her chin held high. She had come back to fight. He stared at her from the floor, his mind a slow, syrupy mess of whiskey and grief. The sight of her, standing on the porch against the vast, moonlit darkness, was so impossible that he was certain she was a phantom, a cruel trick of a broken heart. But then she moved, stepping over the threshold and into the wreckage he had made of their home. She did not gasp or cry out. She simply looked at the overturned table, the shattered lamp, and then at him, her expression a mask of profound sorrow. "I couldn't," she whispered, her voice rough with unshed tears. "I rode for 5 miles, and then I turned around. Running is not a plan." Slowly, painfully, Calder pulled himself into a sitting position, his head throbbing. "Lena, what?" She walked over and knelt in front of him. Amidst the debris, her hands, surprisingly steady, came up to cup his face, her thumbs gently wiping away the grime from his cheeks. "I came back to tell you the truth," she said, her voice gaining a strength that belied the tears shimmering in her eyes. "All of it. You deserve that much." She helped him to the cot, the only piece of furniture left unscathed, and sat beside him. The single candle she had lit cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small cabin feel like a confessional. And in the flickering light, the final, terrible secrets of her past came spilling out. "My father's fortune," she began, her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "It was built on a foundation of betrayal. During the war, he was a supplier. He sold goods to both sides, whatever was most profitable. But his real business was information." Calder listened, the fog of the whiskey beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He had a partner, a man named Marcus Laramie, the patriarch of Jedediah's family. He was a Confederate colonel, a fierce, powerful man. They had a deal. My father would supply information on Union troop movements, and Laramie would ensure my father's trade routes were protected. But my father got greedy. He sold Laramie out, gave his position to a Union general in exchange for a monopoly on all supply contracts in the territory. She took a shuddering breath, the shame of her father's actions, her own burden to bear. The Laramie unit was ambushed, wiped out, almost to a man. Marcus Laramie was captured, and he died of dysentery in a Union prison camp 6 months later. But before he was taken, he managed to get a message to his sons. He told them everything. He told them Silas Hayes owed them a blood debt. The stranger's words echoed in the silence. Asterisk. She was bought with blood and guns. It wasn't a metaphor. It was the literal truth. The Laramies have spent the last decade consolidating their power. Lena continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. They are not like my father. Their power doesn't come from money. It comes from fear and violence. 2 months ago, they came to him. They didn't want his money. They wanted repayment in kind. They wanted to merge our families, to take control of the Hayes name and fortune from the inside. They wanted to own him, the way he had sold them out. The price for my father's life was a daughter. Now Calder understood. The coldness of Jedediah, the relentless pursuit, the chilling confidence of the man in black. It was not the anger of a jilted suitor. It was the methodical collection of a long-overdue debt. "But that's not the worst of it," Lena whispered. And now she finally looked at him, her eyes bottomless pools of despair. "That's not why I came back." She reached into her dress and pulled out a small, silver locket. She opened it. Inside was a tiny, exquisitely painted portrait of a young girl with wide, innocent eyes and a soft, gentle smile. "This is my sister, Clara. She's 17. When the Laramies made the deal, the terms were specific. A daughter of Silas Hayes would marry Jedediah. I am the eldest. The debt falls to me. But the agreement also states that if I refuse, or disappear, the debt is not canceled. It simply passes to the next in line." She choked on a sob. "Clara. They would take Clara. She wouldn't survive a week with that man. She is gentle. She loves music and flowers. She is everything that is still good in our family. My father would give her to them without a second thought to save his own skin. He has already sacrificed one woman he was supposed to love. He would not hesitate to sacrifice another." The full, horrific weight of her dilemma crashed down on Calder. She was trapped. Every path led to a cliff. To run was to condemn her sister. To stay was to condemn herself. And to stay asterisk with him asterisk was to condemn them all. Her flight from the cabin hadn't just been to save him. It had been a desperate, failed attempt to find a third path that didn't exist. He reached out, his hand covering hers. The rage and despair he had felt earlier seemed like a selfish indulgence now. His pain was a simple thing compared to the impossible choice she carried. He looked at the woman beside him, at her strength, at the unbearable burden she was willing to shoulder for her sister. And he felt a surge of love so fierce and so complete, it hurt to breathe. He finally spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "If I lose you, Lena, I have nothing left to live for. I mean that. This place, it was just a tomb before you came here. You brought me back to life." He took a deep breath, his knuckles white as he clenched her hand. "But I will not be the man who keeps you with my own chain. I will not be another cage in your life. What the Laramies and your father are doing, that is not love. That is ownership. And I will not do that to you." He looked her straight in the eye, his own heart breaking with every word. "If you have to go back, I will not stop you." Her composure finally shattered. A raw, wounded cry was torn from her throat, and she collapsed against him, her body shaking with convulsive sobs. All the fight, all the resilience, all the bravery gave way to the simple, crushing agony of her fate. Their last night together was not one of passion, but of quiet, desperate tenderness. He righted the table and they sat before the hearth, the single candle burning between them. He held her as she wept, stroking her hair, whispering meaningless words of comfort, his own tears falling silently into her hair. He was not holding a lover. He was holding onto life itself, trying to memorize the feel of her in his arms, the scent of her skin, the sound of her breathing. They didn't sleep. They talked, their voices low whispers in the darkness. She told him about Clara, about their childhood, about the secret garden where they used to play. He told her about Eleanor, about the small house with the blue shutters they had planned to build. They shared the ghosts of their pasts, offering them to each other as a final, intimate gift in the deepest hours of the night, when the world was utterly still. She would whisper his name over and over, as if the sound of it on her tongue was the only thing anchoring her to this life, to this moment of peace, before the end. He held her closer, his heart a dull, aching drum counting down the final beats of their time together. Dawn came too soon, a cold, gray light that seeped into the cabin like a disease. The time for words was over. A terrible, resolute calm had settled over Lena. She moved with a purpose, dressing not in the tattered finery she'd arrived in, but in the simple, practical clothes Calder had given her. She was no longer a runaway bride. She was a soldier, marching to the gallows to save someone she loved. She braided her hair, her movements quick and efficient. She was ready. As she turned to the door, she saw the paring knife lying on the floor where it had fallen. She picked it up and slid it into her boot. It was a piece of him, a symbol of the strength he had shown her she possessed. She took one last look at him, her eyes conveying everything she could not say, the love, the gratitude, the soul-deep sorrow. "Goodbye, Calder," she whispered. He could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. She turned to go, but stopped. On the table, which he must have placed there in the brief moments she had turned away, was a folded piece of paper. Her name was written on the front in his strong, clear hand. She picked it up and opened it. The note was short, the words stark against the paper. Asterisk. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. Your father owes a debt. I owe you one, for saving my life. I always pay my debts. Asterisk, wait for me. Asterisk, see. Asterisk." A gasp escaped her lips. She looked back at him, her eyes wide with a wild, disbelieving question. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a promise. He wasn't letting her go. He was sending her ahead. A new light kindled in her eyes. It was not the soft glow of happiness, but the hard, dangerous glint of hope. She clutched the note in her hand, her resolve hardening from brittle sacrifice into tempered steel. She gave him one last look, not of goodbye, but of complicity. Then she turned and walked out the door without looking back. Calder stood at the entrance of his empty cabin and watched her ride away. He watched until the figure on the mule was just a tiny speck against the vast, indifferent landscape. He watched until she disappeared completely. Then he turned, his face carved from stone, and began to clean his rifle. The Laramies were owed a blood debt. He intended to help them pay it. The moment Lena's silhouette vanished over the canyon rim, the solitude Calder had once craved returned as a suffocating poison. The silence of the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was a hollow ache, an echo of a life that had been ripped away. But there was no time for grief. Grief was a luxury for men with a future. He had only a promise to keep. He moved with the cold, deliberate purpose of a man who had already accepted the price of his actions. He was no longer hiding. He was hunting. He spent the rest of the day preparing, not like a rancher, but like the soldier he had once been. He cleaned and oiled every weapon he owned, his Colt, the rifle, and a second pistol he took from a locked chest. He packed light, ammunition, a little jerky, and a canteen of water. He was not packing for a journey. He was packing for a war. He looked around the small cabin one last time, at the place where she had brought him back to life, and then he walked out, closing the door on that life forever. He did not look back. His ride to redemption was a grim pilgrimage. He pushed his horse hard, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his face a mask of granite. The man who had fled the world after Eleanor's death was gone, buried in that canyon. This man, the one riding into the heart of his own demise, was someone new. He was fueled by a single, clarifying purpose. He was not fighting for a principle or a cause. He was fighting for a person, and that, he now understood, was the only thing worth dying for. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the First Presbyterian Church of Redemption, the air was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and hypocrisy. For the second time in as many months, the town was gathered to witness the union of the Hayes and Laramie families. This time, however, there was no festive atmosphere. A palpable tension hung over the pews. The Laramie men were not guests. They were guards, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips, their cold eyes scanning the congregation. Silas Hayes stood at the front, his face a mixture of relief and barely concealed fear. He had his daughter back, and with her, his life. Lena stood in a small antechamber, a prisoner in a new wedding dress. This one was even more elaborate than the first, a cage of satin and pearls designed to showcase her as a prize. Her sister, Clara, fussed with the veil, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with terror and confusion.
"Lena, you don't have to do this,"
Clara whispered, tears welling.
"We can run, together."
Lena looked at her sister's innocent, frightened face and felt a surge of love so fierce it was a physical pain. She reached out and gently squeezed Clara's hand.
"It's all right,"
she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm of her sister's fear.
"Everything is going to be all right. I promise."
She was not the same girl who had fled this church in a blind panic. The wild terror had been burned away, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. She had faced down armed men. She had known love and loss, and in her boot, pressed against her skin, was the cool, reassuring weight of the paring knife Calder had given her. In the bodice of her dress, tucked over her heart, was his folded, precious note. Asterisk, wait for me. She was not a victim being led to slaughter. She was a soldier, holding her ground, waiting for her reinforcements. Her expression was serene, her gaze distant, fixed on a point far beyond the stained glass windows. The organ music began, a mournful dirge that signaled the start of the ceremony. Her father entered the room, his face stern. "It is time." He took her arm, his grip like a manacle, as they walked towards the doors that would lead them to the altar. Lena's calm was absolute. She was waiting. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. High noon, the sun beat down on the main street of Redemption, bleaching the dust to a fine, white powder. The town was quiet, the citizens seeking shelter from the oppressive heat. Then came the sound of a lone horse, its hooves clopping at a slow, deliberate pace. Calder rode into town not like a man sneaking in, but like a general reviewing his troops. He sat tall in the saddle, his duster pushed back to reveal the 2 pistols holstered at his hips. His rifle was in its scabbard. He rode down the center of the street until he was directly in front of the church. He stopped, the sun directly behind him, turning him into a dark, formidable silhouette. He didn't dismount. He simply waited. His presence was a challenge, a deafening shout in the sleepy silence. Doors creaked shut. Faces vanished from windows. The town held its breath. The doors of the Laramie saloon burst open. Jedediah Laramie stepped out, flanked by his younger brother and 2 hired guns. Jedediah's face was a mask of arrogant fury. "Calder," he sneered, his hand hovering over his gun.
"I knew you were too stupid to stay away. You've come to watch the wedding? Or did you come to die?"
Calder's voice, when it came, was flat and cold, utterly devoid of emotion.
"I've come to settle a debt, the one your father was owed. I'm here to pay it."
Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound.
"That debt is being paid in the church.
Now get on your horse and ride out of here before I decorate this street with your insides." "The debt was for a life," Calder said, his eyes never leaving Jedediah's. "That's the only payment I'll make." The moment stretched, taut as a wire. The air crackled, and then, all at once, the world exploded in a roar of sound and smoke. Inside the church, the organ music faltered. Lena, standing at the back of the aisle with her father, heard the first shot. It was a sound she now knew intimately, the hard, sharp crack of a Colt peacemaker. It was followed instantly by a volley of others. Her serenity shattered. A gasp escaped her lips. "He's here." "What in God's name was that?" her father hissed, his face pale. Lena didn't answer. She ripped her arm from his grasp and started for the door. "Lena, stop!" he commanded. Jedediah's father, a hard old man with eyes like a vulture, moved to block her path. "The wedding will proceed," he snarled. But the woman he faced was not a frightened girl. She was a cornered wolf, with a speed that stunned them both. She reached into her boot, and the paring knife was in her hand, its sharp point leveled at the old man's throat. "Get out of my way," she commanded, her voice low and shaking with a fury that was more terrifying than any scream. The old man stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. Lena didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, throwing the heavy church doors open and bursting out into the blinding sunlight and the cacophony of the gunfight. The street was a whirlwind of chaos. Calder had dismounted, using his horse for cover. He moved with a lethal economy, the years of solitude stripped away to reveal the trained soldier beneath. He fired, ducked, reloaded, all in one fluid motion. One of the hired guns was already down, sprawled in the dust. The other was pinned behind a water trough, firing wildly. Calder was focused, his world narrowed to the men who were trying to kill him. He didn't see Lena emerge from the church. He felt a searing pain in his left shoulder as a bullet grazed him, but he ignored it. He took aim and fired, and the man behind the trough went silent. Now it was just him and the two Laramie brothers. They had split up, trying to flank him. Jedediah was a decent shot, but he was fueled by rage, not discipline. His shots were wide. Calder, cool and methodical, fired twice. Jedediah's younger brother cried out and fell, clutching his leg. Jedediah screamed in fury and charged, firing recklessly. Calder stood his ground. He felt a punch in his side, a deep, sickening impact that stole his breath and made his vision swim. He stumbled, but he brought his pistol up. He fired. Jedediah stopped, a look of blank surprise on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. Silence. The sudden, ringing absence of noise was as shocking as the violence had been. Smoke drifted in the hot, still air, carrying the acrid smell of burnt powder. It was over. For a moment, Calder remained standing, held upright by sheer will. He looked toward the church, and through the haze and the growing darkness at the edge of his vision, he saw her, a vision in white, standing on the steps, her face a mask of horror. He tried to take a step towards her, to tell her it was all right, that she was free, but his legs would no longer obey him. The strength that had sustained him vanished all at once. The world turned to a dizzying vortex of dust and sky. He sank first to his knees, and then collapsed sideways into the street, the world going black. Lena's scream was a raw, primal sound of pure anguish. She ran, her magnificent dress forgotten, its pristine hem dragging through the dirt and the blood that was already beginning to pool in the dust. She didn't see the shocked faces of the townspeople peering from their windows. She saw only him. She fell to her knees beside him, heedless of the filth. She gathered him into her arms, cradling his head in her lap, her white satin dress instantly soaking up the dark, viscous stain of his lifeblood. His face was pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. His eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on her. "Calder," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face, splashing onto his. His lips moved,
but no sound came out. His eyes began to close. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She had not come this far. She had not found this man, only to lose him now in the dirt of this hateful town. She bent low, her lips close to his ear, her voice a fierce, desperate cry that echoed in the silent street. "Don't die!" she screamed, her voice cracking with the force of her will. "You hear me? Don't you dare die! I won't let anyone take you from me!" The first thing Calder knew was not pain, but thirst, a deep, rasping dryness in his throat that felt older than the world. The second was the smell, not of antiseptic and fear, but of dried herbs, dust, and old pine. He forced his eyes open, expecting the white glare of the Redemption Doctor's ceiling. Instead, he saw rough-hewn ceiling beams, dark with age and smoke, crisscrossed with cobwebs that shifted in the gentle breeze from a single, glassless window. He tried to sit up, but a bolt of white-hot fire shot through his side, and a groan was torn from his lips. He fell back, his head swimming in a dizzying fog. "Easy," a voice said, a voice that was his only anchor in a sea of confusion. "Easy. Calder, just lie still." Lena moved into his line of sight, her form blocking the light from the window. She was no longer a vision in satin and lace. She wore a simple, patched calico dress he'd never seen before. Her face was thin, etched with lines of exhaustion he hadn't seen there before, but her eyes were clear and steady. She held a damp cloth, which she gently placed on his forehead. The coolness was a blessing. "Where?" he managed to rasp, his voice a stranger's croak. "An old homesteader's shack, north of the Cimarron. We're a long way from Redemption," she said, her voice quiet. Memory returned in a brutal, disjointed flash. The gunfight, the smoke, Jedediah falling, the world spinning into darkness, and her face, her beautiful, terrified face, as the last thing he saw. "How?" he whispered, the question encompassing everything. How was he alive? How were they here? A small, wry smile touched her lips for the first time. "You would have been proud of my thieving skills." While the entire town was gaping at the aftermath, I ran back into the church. I took the preacher's offering box for money, ripped bandages from the ladies' aid quilting basket, and stole a bottle of whiskey from the communion stores. Then I hitched up the preacher's own horse and carriage, and with the help of a very scared stable boy who I paid handsomely, we loaded you into the back. We were gone before anyone even thought to look for the bride. He stared at her, trying to reconcile the image of the delicate girl he'd found in the desert with the resourceful, audacious woman who had just described a grand theft and a kidnapping in the same breath. The days that followed were a blur of pain and fevered dreams. Their journey north was a slow, agonizing crawl. Lena drove the stolen carriage relentlessly, pushing the preacher's old horse to its limits, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Calder drifted in and out of consciousness, his world a torment of jolting wagon wheels and the burning fire in his wounds. Through it all, Lena was a constant presence. He would wake to find her changing his bandages, her touch gentle but firm. He would feel the cool rim of a canteen at his cracked lips, her arm supporting his head. He would hear her whispering to him in the dark, her voice a steady, calming current that kept him from being swept away by the fever. She was no longer his student. She was his savior, his nurse, his protector. They finally abandoned the carriage when the trail grew too rough, trading it and the tired horse to a bemused trapper for a sturdy mule, supplies, and directions to a place no one ever went. They found their new home in a small, forgotten valley nestled deep in the northern forests, a world away from the Red Rock Desert. It was a tiny, one-room cabin, built years ago by a prospector who had long since given up his ghost. It was primitive, but it was sound, and a clear, cold stream gurgled nearby. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It smelled of life. Here, slowly, Calder began to heal. The physical recovery was slow and arduous, but the healing of his soul was a more profound transformation. He watched Lena as she made a home out of the wilderness. She learned to fish in the stream, to set snares for rabbits, to identify edible plants. She patched the roof of the cabin with mud and moss and planted a small, hopeful garden in the rocky soil. She was no longer running from anything. She was building. One day, a traveling fur trader passed through their valley, and Lena gave him a letter, along with a silver coin. It became a monthly ritual. She never told Calder what she wrote, but he knew the letters were for Clara. The trader became their only link to the world they had left behind. On one of his visits, months later, he brought news. The gunfight in Redemption had thrown the town into chaos. With both Laramie heirs dead, the family's power, built on fear and violence, had crumbled. Old man Laramie had a stroke, and the family's creditors and rivals had descended like vultures, picking the empire apart. Silas Hayes, his treachery exposed and his powerful alliance destroyed, had been ruined. He had sold the bank and left town in disgrace. Redemption was free of both its tyrants. Clara, the trader had heard, had gone to live with a kindly aunt in St. Louis. She was safe. The news settled a final peace over Lena. The last thread connecting her to her past had been severed, not by her running, but by Calder's stand. As Calder's strength returned, the dynamic between them shifted once more. He took over the heavier work, chopping wood, reinforcing the cabin walls for the coming winter. They worked together, falling into a comfortable, easy rhythm. The quiet companionship they had found in his canyon blossomed here into a deep, unspoken love. There were no grand declarations. There was no need. Their love was in the way he would bring her a wildflower he'd found while hunting, or the way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him when he came in from the cold. It was a love built not on promises, but on shared survival and mutual respect. One crisp autumn morning, Calder returned from a walk in the woods, not with game, but with a new life in tow. Trotting behind him on a rope was a young, long-legged colt, its coat the color of rich earth. It was barely a year old, its eyes wide and curious. Lena came out of the cabin, a smile spreading across her face. "Where on earth did you get him?" "Found him near the aspen grove. His mother was taken by a mountain lion. I think he was all alone," Calder said. He held the rope out to her. "He's yours." Lena approached the colt slowly, holding out her hand. The animal shied away at first, then, with a hesitant step, nudged her palm with its soft nose. She stroked its neck, a wave of pure, simple joy washing over her. She looked at Calder, her eyes shining. "What should we name him?" she asked. Calder looked at her, at the free woman standing before him, at the wild, untamed beauty of their new home, at the endless blue sky above them. "Liberty," he said, his voice soft. "Let's call him Liberty." That evening, as the sun set, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery red and deep gold, they sat together on a large, smooth rock by the stream. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine. Liberty grazed peacefully nearby. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the water flow, listening to the whisper of the wind in the trees. There were no vows here, no contracts, no debts to be paid. There was no need for a preacher or a church to sanctify what they had. They were simply two people, once broken by the world, who had found in each other the strength to mend. They were two solitary souls who had discovered that true freedom wasn't about being left alone, but about finding the one person you didn't want to be alone from. Calder looked at Lena's profile, illuminated by the last, soft rays of the dying sun. He thought of the man he had been, a man living in a self-made tomb, waiting for the end. He had thought he was saving a runaway bride that day in the desert, a beautiful piece of trouble that had stumbled into his path. But he had been wrong. The tears she had shed, the desperate pleas she had made not for love or for pity, but for the simple right to exist, that was what had saved him. Her desperate fight for freedom had shattered the walls of his prison and given him a reason,
finally, to live again. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to this story around the Wild West Campfire. Where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed our tale, please consider subscribing to Wild West Campfire and sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.